All right, Alexander, let's talk about what is happening in Ukraine and let's probably, definitely discuss this article from the Telegraph, which is signaling that even Ukraine's military, even the mighty one-time commander Zaluzhny, who is now currently the ambassador of Ukraine to the UK, he is even signaling that it's time to wind the war down. How is Zaluzhny doing as ambassador to the UK? Actually, on a side note, I mean, is he active in the UK as ambassador? As ambassador, I mean, do you know?
He's all but invisible. I mean, he's not really exercising the proper functions of an ambassador. He's still involved in Ukrainian politics. I mean, he's doing so from far away, from London, but to all intents and purposes, his primary focus is still Ukraine. And as far as I understand it, he's still in some kind of political alliance with Poroshenko, who we'll come to shortly, because Poroshenko has also had a bizarre meltdown. Yeah. And Klitschko, that group.
I mean, those are the three.
The three
that are aligned against Zelensky.
Zelensky. Yeah.
All right. Let's get into this Telegraph article. Very very interesting.
It was a very interesting article. Now, the Telegraph has never up to now wavered in its utter devotion and support for Ukraine. If you want to read the Telegraph's accounts of what's happening, it's all pretty much an adventure story, basically, sort of thriller in which the Ukrainians single-handed. Each one defeats a vast army of Russians. They go from victory to victory. The Russians always lose. They're always incompetent. They're always inefficient. The Ukrainians are always heroic and successful. Over the last few weeks, the Telegraph has started to wind down. I've noticed this. They've started to wind down their Ukraine war coverage. And every so often, they've been a bit more realistic about the realities. But just a few weeks ago, they were publishing an article by the same journalist, Roland Oliphant, who was saying that the Russian offensive had not gone at all well. They might have got fairly close to Pokrovsk, but it was clearly running out of steam. Interesting to read an article by the same journalist a few weeks later. Even he, after talking to Ukrainian soldiers, seems to acknowledge that the war is now unwinnable by Ukraine. They're not yet prepared to say that Ukraine is losing. But if you read the interviews with the soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers that he's spoken to, particularly one who's a drone operator, clearly they think that the war is lost.
Okay, why can't the collective West admit that they've lost this war? I mean, at the end of the day, I just want to say that is the important part to all of this, isn't it? Because Ukraine will keep on fighting, at least as long as they can. Unfortunately, because the collective West pushes them to continue.
Yeah. Well, this is the
extreme. They can't surrender Ukraine. The U.S. doesn't. The West doesn't let them.
No, this is the extreme cruelty of the thing, because if you go back to that same article, they're still hoping somehow that the West will pull it off for them. Not that they will win the war. They don't believe that. The Ukrainian soldiers don't believe that any longer, but that the West will secure for them a better peace. And they want Western support to continue and to increase. And you remember we did a program a short time ago in which we talked about the fact that there's already a narrative starting to appear in Ukraine that Ukraine is the only reason it lost the war is because the West wasn't there. It wasn't fully behind them. A kind of stab in the back myth. You can see elements of that in this article. They're saying, if the West had gone all in at the beginning, given Ukraine everything it wanted, everything it asked for, it would have won the war. And now the West must make up for that by giving Ukraine everything it asks for so that Ukraine can come out with some kind of acceptable peace. And the reason they're doing that is because the West still talks about supporting Ukraine. It still is stringing the Ukrainians along, giving the Ukrainians the impression that they can go on fighting, the West will be there, and that will somehow fight the Russians to a standstill. Even though the article itself says that Western officials have assessed the mood in Moscow and on Putin's part, and they haven't noticed any sign of wavering on that side at all. So we have this extraordinary situation. Everybody, Ukrainian soldiers, Western officials, understand that the war is lost, but they're locked in to fighting it. And going back to the current moves that we see at the moment, it's exactly what we've discussed in previous programs. What you said, the United States especially is doing everything it possibly can to keep Ukraine still fighting until not just after the election, but until after the new president takes office. So they want to keep the war going for another 4 months, another 3 to 4 months, because that is the major priority now. Not to have Ukraine collapse on the present president's watch.
Yeah, and Sullivan's watch and Blinken's watch.
And Lloyd Austin's watch. He's in Kiev, by the way. He's just gone there. Apparently, he's telling the Ukrainians.
Surprise.
Exactly. It's a surprise visit, but apparently he's telling the Ukrainians, the US is right behind you, but we're not going to give you more weapons. We're not going to give you permission to use your long-range missiles. We'll give you everything we can, short of those things that you're basically asking us for. So it's all about keeping the war going for the next 3 to 4 months. It's unbelievably cynical.
And I think we need to clarify that the U.S., Europe for sure, but even the U.S., they don't have anything more to give. I mean, they can empty out their entire inventory of weapons. Sure, they can empty out everything they have, and they still won't win, and they know it. But for any military, they can't do something like that. Like the U.S. military can't empty out all of their weapons and give it to Ukraine. Obviously, that can't be done. But they've given everything. That's why when you hear reports of Ukraine isn't getting enough weapons, or Ukraine needs more weapons, or anything like that, which the media every now and then talk about a lot. They talk about it a lot. The honest truth is there are really no more weapons to give, or at least not in a significant amount that will make any difference whatsoever. And then you don't even get into Ukraine's soldiers, the attrition. They've given all the money they could, the economic state of Ukraine. My philosophy has always been, if the way I've looked at this conflict, if NATO and the U.S. could win this war, they would have done it. They would have done everything they can, but they can't. They would have given whatever they could. They can't. Yeah.
Well, that is exactly correct. What was last year's summer offensive about? It was an attempt to win the war. It was an attempt to defeat Russia, to break through to the Sea of Azov and to the Black Sea, to isolate Crimea, to put Crimea under siege. That was not intended to achieve a stalemate in the war. It was intended to defeat Russia. That was the plan. They gave Ukraine everything they could, as they thought, to achieve that, and it failed. And they've been giving Ukraine ATACMS missiles, many more, by the way, than they've officially admitted to. You can see that by counting the numbers of ATACMS missiles that have been used. And apparently the stockpile is not large, and apparently it's running down. They've given Ukraine, the British and the French, have given them huge numbers of Storm Shadows and Scalp missiles, and the stockpile there is apparently almost exhausted. The real reason they're pressuring the Germans to give the Taurus missiles is because there are so few Storm Shadows and Scalps left. They've stripped themselves to the furthest possible point in terms of Patriot missiles and other air defense missiles. Europe is now critically short of air defense missiles. The United States still has quite a few, but of course it's now got to think about Israel and what's going on in the Middle East. It's got to also think about the Pacific. It doesn't have many more spare missiles to give. And the F-16 saga has turned into a total and absolute shambles, as many people said it would. First F-16 that was operated crashed because it seems pilot error, because the pilots are insufficiently trained. The F-16s, we're told that there's going to be a complete calibration of the entire training program. They're not going to be operating properly until March, except, of course, it's most unlikely they'll be operating even in March, not at the rate this is going. This has proved a complete disaster. As all of the people who understand these things, including the key people in the Pentagon, said, so there is nothing more to give. The Ukraine's been given everything that could be given. The shell saga, the artillery shell saga, we've discussed that many, many places. Pavel's plan to buy shells on the international arms market, which they didn't find enough shells. A significant portion of the ones they got were duds. The Europeans have only fractionally managed to increase shell production. The intentions to do so were unsuccessful. The Americans a little bit more successful there, but then again, nowhere near enough. So, I mean, it just isn't possible. And again, this is where Ukrainians are not being told the truth. They're still being fed the lie, because it is a lie, that the West is so powerful, so industrially strong that it can provide unlimited quantities of weapons as it did during the Second World War, except, of course, that it can't unless it does what it's accusing the Russians of doing, which is running a full mobilization war economy, which, as we've discussed before, simply is not militarily acceptable in the West. So, yes, they've done everything they possibly can and more. They've gone further on several issues than the Pentagon would have liked, and it hasn't worked.
Yeah, war economy. There's no way they could do a war economy. There's not one country in Europe that could handle a war economy. It would collapse. All of Europe would completely collapse. And the United States would not be able to handle a war economy either. Not now. Not in the state that it's in today. No. Not going to happen. No. And I think this is why you're hearing the rhetoric coming out of NATO. People like Cavoli and Rutte, the new Secretary General, why they're shifting the narrative. They're manipulating the narrative so as to make it be about spending more into NATO. We have a strong Russian military now on our borders. Whatever happens in the war, they're saying, Russia's going to be there and they're going to be stronger than ever. So we need all of the NATO members to really ramp up the spending into NATO. They're out of weapons. They're demilitarized. They need to replenish the stockpiles, and they need to figure out an excuse to keep NATO going, to keep the spending going into NATO, to even ramp up the spending going into NATO. So I mean, they're really flipping things around to the detriment of Ukraine, to the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian soldiers, but to the benefit of NATO. At the end of the day, this is now about bettering NATO for them. It's not about Ukraine anymore to me. This is about Ukraine's lost. Now we got to figure out a way to keep NATO alive, keep it growing, keep it thriving, and to replenish all the weapons that the Russians have destroyed.
Absolutely. Cavoli's comments were really very interesting. I mean, you talked about the Russians having a much better army now than they did before. Do you remember all that business about weakening Russia? It's turned out even Cavoli can see that it's made Russia stronger. So this is what it's all about. It's holding NATO together, increasing the funding for NATO. But what we've seen, and we've seen this repeatedly, is that increasing funding, which you can do, is not in itself enough. It is not the solution to the problem unless you set out and to work out a proper industrial program. And doing that takes years. A proper industrial program to be able to build tanks and shells and guns and drones and all of the other things in the sort of quantities that are being spoken of when you no longer have the industrial base and you no longer have the engineering skills and you no longer have the organization. Doing that from scratch is something that will take at least 5 to 10 years. And it would require a degree of focus and a degree of, financial and intellectual discipline and managerial skills, which I just don't get the sense. Certainly in Europe, maybe they do to some extent still exist in the United States, but in Europe they simply don't exist at all. And it's not going to happen at a time when budgetary crisis right across Europe, at a time when the United States is already adding $1 trillion to its deficit, to its debt every 3 months. I just don't see how this is possible. I think people need to be realistic, and they need to understand. Firstly, I think they need to fess up to the Ukrainians, to tell them straightforwardly, look, we have done everything we can. We cannot do more. It didn't work. You're not going to win. In light of this, what you need to do is to negotiate, because the alternative is you're going to lose. And they need to fess up to themselves and to the people of the West. Not that they're going to do any of those things.
NATO cannot admit defeat, right? They can't admit that they lost. That would be a disaster for NATO.
No, absolutely. Well, of course, if they did that, that would be an internal crisis right across the West. It would mean suddenly a recognition that we're no longer as powerful as we pretended to ourselves that we were. And of course, countries around the world, Israel, Taiwan, to name two, might on that basis start to reassess their policies and to come to conclusions. Now, that I think actually would be a good thing. If countries like, say, Taiwan and Israel decided that they didn't have an overwhelming support, force supporting them, they might start to take more realistic to adopt more realistic policies. But in Washington, they're terrified of that. They're terrified that if they admit that they're weaker than they are, then they want people to think. If they admit that they're weaker than they want people to think, or than they represent, then they're afraid that their allies will peel away.
Zaluzhny, he is positioning himself as the man who can negotiate, do you think? Because, I mean, you read his statements in this article from the Telegraph, going back to the article in the Telegraph. By the way, the title of the article, for everyone that may be interested in this article, is "Even Ukraine's Fiercest Soldiers Want the War to Stop." Zaluzhny, is he positioning himself as someone who can negotiate with Russia, who is a realist, as opposed to Zelensky, who is in fantasy land and has ruled off any negotiations with Russia? Is that how you see it, or is something else going on? Because he's featured prominently in this article, Zaluzhny.
Yes, absolutely. And he's not new, by the way. Way back in 2022, when he gave an interview to the Economist, he actually spoke about himself as doing what General Mannerheim, who was the Finnish commander-in-chief in the Winter War between the Soviet Union and Finland, eventually did. The Finns initially were very successful in that war, but eventually the Soviet resources ground them down. And Mannerheim told the Finnish soldiers, look, we fought heroically, but we can't go on fighting. We've got to negotiate an armistice, because otherwise we will be completely defeated and Finland will disappear. And that was what happened with Mannerheim in 1940. And it was interesting, way back in December 2022, that already at that time, Zaluzhny was talking about that. So I think that's what he's doing now. He's trying to position himself both to the Western powers and to whatever realists there still are in Kiev as the one person who can come forward. He's got the confidence of the army, the support of the army. He's widely liked across society. He's the man who can negotiate with the Russians and reach a deal with them. His partner, Poroshenko, I have to say, he gave an interview the other day on Ukrainian television in which he seemed to have a complete meltdown, said that he single-handedly fought off the Russians. That was almost the impression he gave in February, March 2022, that the entire government fled Kiev, that he was the only person left, that he basically was the one who held it all together. It was most bizarre to see. And I have to say, I have to say after that, any idea that Poroshenko could step in and fulfill that kind of role just doesn't seem to me remotely plausible. But anyway, that's what Zaluzhny is trying to do. I think that perhaps come January, when the new president takes over, whoever that president is, and by the way, there's an article in Bloomberg which says that if it's President Harris who takes over in January, she too will probably want to find some way to dial down the war. I mean, that's Bloomberg saying that. So whoever the new president is, they might at that point decide that Zaluzhny is the only person who can do it, because as we saw, Zelensky himself is living in fantasy land. He's completely incapable of negotiating with the Russians after the performance he put on last week. The Russians will not negotiate with him. I mean, they will never trust him.
Final question. Will the Russians go for a plan like what we've just outlined, a Zaluzhny plan? Will they negotiate with someone like Zaluzhny or no?
Well, they will negotiate, but on their terms. Why should they settle for less when they're winning the war? And Putin gave a massive press conference to journalists from the BRICS states, and he was tougher than I've ever known him to be up to now. He said, first of all, the status of the four regions isn't negotiable. They're now part of Russia. That's not going to even form a part of the negotiations anymore. So he's taken that off discussion. It's going to be Istanbul plus from the tone that he gave. I mean, it's going to be very hard terms indeed. Basically, he was hinting that from this point on, it's going to be going much further than Istanbul was. Now, whether Zaluzhny understands that, whether when he meets with Putin, if he does, or if he sends a negotiating team to negotiate with Putin, he's going to be prepared to accept Putin's terms, is a completely different matter. Eve Smith once made a really good point that in the West, everybody always negotiates with each other before they sit down and try to negotiate with the Russians. And the result is that they are not listening to the evolution of Russian thinking. Zaluzhny is now so much part of this that I think he too doesn't yet understand how hard the Russian positions are now becoming.
Yeah. All right. I just wonder if there's someone in Kiev who could be I don't know, the Lukashenko of Ukraine, because I think that's the only way that Ukraine remains. I mean, is that I think that's pretty accurate to say that. I think the only way Ukraine remains, like Odessa and Kiev, the only way that remains as a functioning state is if you find a Lukashenko who is very much aligned with Russia. The collective West may not want to see it like that. They don't want to hear something like that, but I don't see another way that Ukraine as a functioning state remains. I mean, is Zaluzhny that guy, or is there someone in Kiev who can function in that role?
I'm not aware of anybody in Kiev who can function in that role. All of those people, and there used to be lots of such people, and there used to be some of them very clever people. They're all either in Moscow or elsewhere. They've all been driven out of Ukraine. One can perhaps construct scenarios where, in a period of tremendous crisis, some of them return to Kiev, people like Medvedchuk, for example, and or Azarov or someone like that step in. I can't really imagine that happening. I can't imagine a situation where people like that are invited back to Kiev and lead the government there. So I don't think there is such a person, frankly. As I said, to the extent that they exist in Moscow now. They're all in exile.
Yeah, all right. Because someone like Zaluzhny, if someone like that was to negotiate, if they got the opportunity to negotiate with Russia, I mean, the Russians would be well aware that when the negotiations would conclude, whatever the deal made, whatever the outcome, that leadership would once again, over time, start with the NATO, EU rhetoric, right? The talk about we have to get into NATO. I mean, that would happen no matter what.
Yeah.
I mean, the Russians know that, right? I mean,
absolutely. Well, Putin made in this massive press conference, he made exactly that point. He said that this has to be a permanent peace, a peace in which we agree terms and the war ends, and then it turns out that that's just another opportunity for Ukraine to rearm and reorient itself again to the West, and so that the whole thing deteriorates all over again and the war has to resume in 2 or 5 or 10 years' time. That is unacceptable. He actually said that. And he's very well aware of that risk, and he's very, very well aware of the fact that if there is a Zaluzhny or someone like him takes over in Kiev, comes to an agreement, even on Istanbul plus terms, then the risk is that Ukraine will drift back into exactly those kind of policies that you've been saying, because NATO and the EU would continue their pressure, in which case the Russians will have to react. So Putin is not going to let that happen, and he made that absolutely clear. He wants a situation where the Ukraine problem is solved once and for all. And I can't imagine any proposals that come with that anyone in Kiev at the moment is going to accept. That's the truth.
All right. That's the truth, yeah. Exactly. All right. We will end the video there. The Duran.locals.com. We are on Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, Rockfit, and Twitter X. And go to the Duran shop. Pick up some merch, like the shirts we are wearing today in this video. Use the code October20, October20, and get 20% off all merchandise in our shop. The link is in the description box down below. Take care.